Guys, let's talk about satiety, ketogenic diets, and so on and so forth. And I want to bring the attention to a recent article posting based upon a paper that she recently published by my friend Amber O'Hearn. Amber O'Hearn is someone who I think you should all follow. She's been in the carnivore space for, 15 plus years, is incredibly insightful, does not get enough credit for what she has done. And again, that's a shame. Hopefully she writes a book, and I'd be happy to help her promote it, because she has some very good insight into a number of things. Her story basically revolves around her going eventually carnivore initially to lose weight, but then it put her bipolar disorder into remission, and there you go. And she's been quite insightful into some of this stuff. So this recent article that she published based on a scientific paper she actually published talks about how fat loss and satiety, and in many cases, she talks about this energocentric model. And if you read the paper, it also delves into sleep and some of the commonalities between sleep and satiety, or sleep and hunger have. And it's quite it's kind of technical. It's worth reading. There's a lot of, maybe you might have to read it a couple times to fully get the gist of it. But the blog post summarizes it fairly nicely, I think. And I think some of the take-home messages are that, if we go into a quote-unquote a caloric deficit, if we start experiencing hunger in that same situation, that often means that our body is unable to provide the resources to match that hunger, or to restore the metabolic rate. And therefore, if you cut 1,000 calories out of your diet, but you're still feeling hungry, you're not getting 1,000 calories out of those tissues. So you're not actually losing the weight, you're just experiencing hunger. And that is sort of I guess maybe that's a central tenet. I'd love to talk with Amber in detail, maybe in the form of a podcast or some sort of discussion to further flesh this out. But I mean, and it shows, and she talks about the different phases of, starvation, hunger, and, first you kind of burn through your glucose reserves, and you go through your fat reserves, and finally you go through your lean mass. And, reading this, and I'd encourage you guys to read the entire paper. I'll post a link for it in the description here. But I think that, it reminds me of some of the work done initially back in the early 1920s by a guy named Louis Newberg at the University of Michigan, back when he was dealing with diabetics. And they had really type 1 diabetics. And type 1 diabetics, as you remember, don't have any insulin, and so they're constantly catabolizing their tissues. And they would have ridiculously high glucose levels. They would go into DKA, they would get septic, they would die. And one of the things they were using to try to treat that was by providing them substrate to prevent the catabolism, basically. I think that's eventually what they were doing, because what they were doing is they were causing them to consume a very high fat diet. Something like 90% of their calories are coming from fat. And that would reliably shut down the hyperglycemia, and what they could measure was the glucosuria, the glucose in the urine, because they didn't really have good ways to measure it back then. But I think what was happening is, because energy was being provided exogenously, they weren't using and weren't catabolizing their own tissue. And so, this could have a lot of implications. Let's say you're a diabetic that has a dawn effect. You have all these kind of regulatory hormones that are coming. Some of that's being glucose dumped from the liver. If you're in a low carb state, perhaps you're catabolizing some lean tissue. And maybe that could be avoided by providing enough energy substrate, perhaps in the form of fat. So it's an interesting discussion, talking about satiety, satiation, and then the implications around sleep. And the paper goes into sleep a lot more than the blog post does. But I thought they were very interesting. I encourage you guys to read it. And like I said, Amber, if you see this, let's have a discussion if you're willing to. Anyway, you guys take care. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.